Chapter 12. Plans. Although I had spoken so boldly to Sophia, the task that I had set myself seemed, on reflection, well nigh an impossible one. For one mouse to defy the entire court of France, rescue 7 captive children from beneath the very throne of the Queen, and then transport them and their mother to America, appeared to be more than even I could accomplish. But events played into my hands. Suddenly we received the glad news of Lord Cornwallis's surrender to General Washington. General Washington and our gallant army were victorious. The war was ended. The colonies were free. We celebrated that night, Ben and me, over cheese and ale. We celebrated so thoroughly that, to tell the truth, I was rather indisposed the next day, and Ben had an attack of gout that lasted a week. Of course, I was all eagerness to leave for home at once. Our long residence among the French, whose foreign ways I always did detest, and the separation from my family, had proved to be very trying. I also thirsted to fulfill my pledge to Sophia, now that my duty to General Washington was done, but Ben showed no inclination to depart. He was having such a good time being admired, dining out and showing off at court, that I could not get him even to consider our return to America. Every time I brought up the subject, he put me off with one excuse or another, usually accompanied by a maxim. He was really very irritating. But when the King and Queen of France announced that a great ball would be given in his honor on the 4th of July, he became positively unbearable. He fluttered about from one tailor to another as excitedly as a young belle preparing her trousseau. The house became infested with hairdressers and shirt-makers. He even had his nails manicured. This was really alarming. Worry and irritation over his behavior must have sharpened my wits, for I soon conceived a plan that promised to solve all our problems. Completely washing my hands of Ben and his ridiculous antics, I plunged into my preparations with intense energy. Calling together all the peasant mice of Versailles, where we lived, I told them the story of Sophia's wrongs and revealed the details of my plan. With one voice they promised their support. They were a rather stupid, timid lot, but being downtrodden and half-starved, they naturally hated the aristocrats of Versailles. Next, I visited several of the embassies where, in the course of my spying activities, I had made many acquaintances. The Russian mice were wild, uncouth fellows, but terrible fighters and always ready for an affray. They answered my plea for aid with enthusiastic shouts. The Swedes were next. Stalwart, steady, powerful warriors, I counted on them greatly, and I was overjoyed when, after soberly considering my speech, they promised their assistance. I also managed to enlist the service of a few Italian and Spanish mice, but knowing their erratic temperaments, I did not count on them greatly. I placed my main reliance on the Swedes and Russians. How I longed for Red Jefferson! How invaluable his flaming speeches and inspiring leadership would be at just such a moment. My joy knew no bounds when Ben announced at dinner that Mr. Thomas Jefferson was arriving in Paris that night. Surely Red would be with him. "Mr. Jefferson is to be America's first ambassador to France," said Ben, rather sadly. "And I suppose, will no longer be necessary here." "I've been telling you that for several months," I replied. "Perhaps Mr. Jefferson can convince you of it." "Never mind, Ben," I went on, for he looked pretty hurt. "Think of the 4th of July ball. You'll be the center of attention." He cheered up then and resumed his foppish preparations, leaving me free to continue my own arrangements. Surely enough, Red arrived that night with Mr. Jefferson. Fiery and rebellious as ever, he fell in with my plans at once. He fairly boiled with rage when I recounted the tale of Sophia's wrongs at the hands of the palace crew. "Patricians," he snorted. aristocrats, oppressors, despots, vultures. Liberty and justice, Amos. Tell me your plans. When do we strike? Together we went over every detail of my preparations. Red approved of all that I had done and had several excellent suggestions of his own. Our forces, Amos, he said, are weak for such an undertaking. The white mice of Versailles are known to number many hundreds, perhaps thousands. Pampered fops though they are, there are many skilled swordsmen among them. Your Russians and Swedes are good, but few in number. The peasant mice of Versailles are uncertain. They are prone to panic. What would I not give for a handful of good, true blue Yankees? A very brilliant thought struck me. John Paul Jones, I shouted. His fleet is at the port of Lorient. His shipwrights are the greatest fighters in the world. One of his lieutenants is in Paris now and returns to Lorient tonight. I shall send a plea for assistance in his cocked hat. They will not fail us. Splendid, Amos, exclaimed Red. Splendid. I also have had a thought. The downtrodden slum mice and sewer rats of Paris are ripe for revolution. Starved and oppressed, they have long chafed under the tyranny of these mincing patricians. All that they lack is a leader. I will be that leader. Liberty forever. His red fur bristling with energy, he dashed off into the night, while I busied myself with the message to the shipwrights of John Paul Jones. Ben came in before I had finished and began to preen himself before the mirror. A delightful evening, Amos, delightful. You really should have been along. Charming people, witty conversation. By Dr. Franklin, I suppose, said I. My new waistcoat was greatly admired, he went on. Oh, don't bother me, I snapped testily. I have no time for mincing popinjays. I'm busy. Busy? He asked. Why, Amos, this is the time of peace, the time to cultivate the finer things of life. The war is over. That's what you think, I said. Good night and horrid nightmares. Chapter 13. The Battle of Versailles. July 4th arrived and found my preparations complete. Red Jefferson came to report late in the morning. His disheveled fur and red-rimmed eyes indicated sleepless nights of effort, but he was, as always, brimful of energy and enthusiasm. All is in readiness, Amos, he said. The sewers are in a turmoil. Revolution and liberty fill the air. Vengeance is on every tongue. I can scarce restrain their ardor. See that you do, I said. One false move would ruin everything. Remember now, the third south window of the throne room. Here is your map of the palace grounds. The night will be warm and all windows open. The signal is, up and at 'em, and not a move or a sound before that signal. I am depending on you. Red glanced grimly at the cudgel with which he had armed himself. I had a winter at Valley Forge under von Steuben, he said. I know something of discipline. Trust me, Amos. Liberty and justice forever. He was off again, and I thanked Providence that he had sent me this dynamic lieutenant. In the afternoon, I visited Sophia for last-minute instructions. Although trembling slightly with excitement, she retained the poise of a true aristocrat. The Russians and Swedes will report to you, I told her. They are the most dependable. I myself shall take charge of the Versailles peasants, who require a firm hand. How about the headdress? A splendid one for our purpose, Monsieur Amos, she said. Would you care to see it? Peering through a curtain, we could see 3 hairdressers and 2 maids arranging Madame Brillon's headdress for the ball. I had seen many elaborate hair arrangements at the court, but this far exceeded anything I had ever beheld. The powdered curls, rising to a height of 4 feet above her head, were arranged to represent the waves of the ocean. Surmounting these was a full-rigged ship with an American flag at the masthead. Long red, white, and blue ribbons inscribed Liberty and Justice flew from the bowsprit. Just below the ship was a colored wax medallion of Ben, upheld by pink cupids and decorated with some silly sentiment. "Perfect," I said. "The ship will hold all the Swedes. They are great sailors, and they will feel at home there. The Russians you will have to take inside, unfortunately. They are a bit uncouth." "This is not a moment to worry about daintiness," she replied calmly. "You are splendid, madam," I exclaimed. "Courage now, and trust me. Remember the signal, up and at 'em. Not a sound or a movement before that. Fear not, all will be well." "Bless you, monsieur," she said bravely. "Liberty and justice." The peasant mice reported to me early in the evening. They were a rather motley crew, armed with scythes, clubs, and other crude weapons. I had drilled them as well as possible, but had no great confidence in their steadiness. I did try to impress on them the need for absolute obedience and silence. Ben, of course, was in a twitter of excitement over his new clothes. This was fortunate, for I was able to stow all my awkward band aboard him without attracting his attention. As a matter of fact, in his state of excitement, a swarm of bees could have traveled in his cap, and he would never have noticed. 12 of us occupied the fur cap, I being stationed at the peephole in front. The rest I secreted in various pockets. One clever little fellow clung to Ben's watch fob, which gave him the appearance of being a charm or ornament of some sort. Once we were safely started for the ball, I gave a sigh of relief. All seemed to be going well. True, there was no word from the ship-rats of John Paul Jones, but I had done all I could. We must do our best without them. The palace of Versailles was a scene of the greatest gaiety. Lights were everywhere, fireworks filled the sky, orchestras played. The great halls were crowded with guests, all come to honor the United States and Ben. The lights, the opulent costumes, the sounds and splendors of the court all brought a great chattering from my country-bred cohort, which I sternly suppressed. We paused briefly at the entrance to the throne room while a path was cleared for Ben, and I had a moment to glance around. Among the throng I spied Madame Brillon. From the slight quivering of her towering headdress, I knew that Sophia's contingent was present. A glimpse of Red's flaming head on the third south windowsill reassured me that he and his mob were faithful. Ben, of course, was the center of all attention. Every eye was upon him as we advanced slowly up the length of the great hall. As we approached the magnificent throne where the king and queen sat, I nudged the leader of my peasants. "Ready," I muttered. I could feel Ben trembling with excitement as he halted to make his bow. At that tense moment, I leaned from the peephole and shouted in my loudest tones the agreed signal, "Up and at 'em!" Ben fairly dripped mice. My peasant regiment swarmed from his coat, his hat, and his waistcoat. Forming in company front at his feet, as I had trained them, they charged toward the queen's throne. A scene of the wildest confusion followed. The queen and 27 of her courtiers promptly fainted. The king, pale and trembling, rose from his throne and rushed toward the window, only to be met by Red and his shrieking rabble of slum mice and sewer rats. Thereupon the king also fainted, and was rather badly trampled by the fleeing ladies of the court. The white mice of the palace guard, although taken by surprise, soon rallied, driving back the first charge of my undisciplined peasants. But now the Swedes and Russians joined the fray, and the battle raged fiercely about the ankles of the queen. Alas for Red's faith in the proletariat! At the first sight of the lavish refreshments spread out in the adjoining rooms, his fickle revolutionists dropped their weapons and rushed for the food. Screaming with rage and disappointment, Red dashed into the fray. His flashing cudgel and flaming fur were always in the thickest of the fighting. One by one, the peasants of Versailles deserted and joined in demolishing the refreshments. The Swedes and Russians, led by the intrepid Red, battled doggedly, but the tide was turning against them. From every corridor of the palace came swarms of white mice to reinforce the ranks of the enemy. Inch by inch we were being forced back from our goal, the cell where Sophie's children lay. Amid the confusion of the conflict, I was suddenly aware of a clear, thin piping sound. Could it be? Yes, surely it was. Through the hot summer air came the shrill scream of a fife, and the tune was Yankee Doodle. Through the window they came piling, the sailor rats of John Paul Jones, 50 fighting Yankees. Lafayette, we are here! Flashing cutlasses and flailing handspikes drove through the throng. The white mice fled like snowflakes before a wind. In no time the cage was captured, the door demolished, and Sophia's children brought forth free mice. A grizzled old boatswain pulled his forelock. "Captain Jones' compliments," he said. "Any further orders?" Red appeared, dripping sweat and blood, his eyes flashing. "Orders?" he shouted. "Orders? Yes, by heaven!" He pointed to the refreshment room. "That rabble, that scum, clear them out." "Aye, aye, sir," said the boatswain. The cutlasses flashed, and the deserters fled, shrieking before them. "It's yours, boys," said Red. "Help yourselves." And then to me, "I'm done, Amos," and he slumped to the floor. Madame Brouillon had fainted out of politeness to the Queen. We rescued Sophia from the wreckage of the headdress, and it did my heart good to see her joyous reunion with her 7 children. Poor Ben, looking perfectly dazed, he stood alone in the center of a large empty space. Everyone had crowded away from him as though he were infected with the plague. The king, by now recovered, was conferring with a group of his generals, all of whom were darting angry glances at Ben. I began to fear for his safety. With Sophia's assistance, I managed to get the half-conscious Red into the fur cap. Then Sophia and her happy brood climbed aboard. "Ben," I suggested, "don't you think we'd better get home? You seem to have lost a great deal of your popularity." We left by a rear door, still shunned by all present. As we passed the refreshment room, Sophia and the children waved happily to their rescuers, who were boisterously celebrating the victory. The grizzled boatswain led them in 3 hearty cheers, and we left the palace with the roaring chorus of a Yankee ship and a Yankee skipper ringing in our ears. "The French, Ben," I said, "are a fickle people. One moment you're a hero, and the next an outcast. When do we sail for home?" He seemed still in a daze. "I don't know, Amos," he said uncertainly. "Whenever you say, I guess." Chapter 14. Home. The voyage home was made most pleasant for me by the gracious presence of Sophia and her charming children. Ben, however, was quite downcast. He had gone to the palace of Versailles the day after the great battle and had been severely snubbed. The guard, indeed, had been quite rude, making some unpleasant remark about people who shed mice. All his ladies and countesses had also refused to admit him. "But, Ben," I said, "don't you realize that our own country of America is waiting to welcome you back as a hero?" "Do you really think so, Amos?" he asked, brightening. Will we be heroes?" "Of course we will," I said. Haven't we raised the money for the whole War of Independence? Why, General Washington himself will probably be at the dock to meet us. There will be bands and parades." "Maybe you're right, Amos," he said, all cheered up again. "Do you think there'll be fireworks?" Our reception was everything that even Ben could have hoped for. There were salutes of cannon and firearms. There were delegations from Congress and a message from General Washington. The mayor, the city council, and the 1st Volunteer Fire Brigade were all present, dressed in their best uniforms. There were floats, addresses, bands, and a parade. Ben, beaming with pride, occupied the first carriage. As usual, he wore the old fur cap, now so ancient and threadbare that there were plenty of peepholes for Sophia and me and all the 7 children. They naturally were in a state of the greatest excitement, what with the bands, the crowds, and their first sight of the New World. Sophia retained her usual well-bred dignity, but her pink eyes sparkled with joy at the prospect of joining her husband. And my first glance assured me that he was a worthy husband and father for this charming family. I left them to their newfound happiness and accompanied Ben to a great banquet that was being given in his honor by the city council. During the long, wordy speeches, I lay in the cap and thought over the events of the last few years. I had done my duty to General Washington. I had contributed no little to our victory in the war so recently won. The colonies were free. I had redeemed my promise to Sophia, rescued her children, and reunited her family. Ben was now old enough to keep out of trouble. Well, fairly well. At last, I thought, I can relax. Before us lies a peaceful and uneventful old age. I must be getting old, I thought sleepily, as Ben's voice boomed and meandered on, describing his brilliant triumphs in France. I can even stand these dinners. And then I slept. I was perfectly right about getting old. We were old. I found more and more pleasure in staying quietly at home where I could enjoy the company of Sophia's children. Their father had prospered in the New World. He had established a most comfortable home for his family in a house not far from Ben's, and a delightful household it was. Many of the court customs that they had brought from France, especially their fondness for dancing all night, were considered somewhat frivolous by the more staid Philadelphia mice, but their gaiety and lively ways made them most popular among the younger set. The older people, in turn, soon succumbed to the wit and charm of Sophia and her husband. Before long their home became one of the most brilliant in the city. My own brothers and sisters had also progressed in the world. Most of the older ones had married and were raising families of their own. Several of them lived in our immediate neighborhood, successful, solid tradesmen. The arrival of these sprightly foreigners brought a new joy and lightness into their rather dull lives, and they became among the most regular attendants at Sophia's social gatherings. The 3 youngest, Xenophon, Isabel, and Zenas, who were about the age of Sophia's 3 oldest, were especially charmed with the newcomers, and were always to be seen in their company. It was one of the happiest moments of my life when, at a brilliant triple wedding ceremony, those 6 young hearts became as 3. Chapter 15. Happy Birthday. It is not surprising that I preferred to stay at home, surrounded by these lively young ones, rather than to accompany Ben to his innumerable dinners and committee meetings. Now that the war was over, these were very dull and unimportant affairs anyway, at which Ben seldom needed my advice. I slept through all of them, and suspect that Ben usually did too. However, I hesitated to mention my boredom, lest I hurt his feelings. The approach of his 81st birthday promised a solution of the difficulty. I had noticed for some time that he was becoming slightly ashamed of the old fur cap, which really was pretty shabby. A few days before his birthday, I purchased the finest beaver hat to be found in the whole city of Philadelphia. It was a splendid affair, pale gray, turned out in the latest French fashion, and just Ben's size. It cost me a pretty penny, too. In fact, I had to call on my brothers Claude, Daniel, and Ephraim for financial aid, which they gladly supplied. I told my family in Sophia's of my plans for Ben's birthday. They were overjoyed at an opportunity to show their gratitude to one who had done so much for all of us, and plunged into the preparations with the greatest enthusiasm. On the eve of Ben's birthday, we gathered behind the books in his study. There was quite a crowd. All my brothers and sisters, from Bathsheba to Zenas, with their husbands, wives, and children were there, as well as Sophia, her husband, and their children. My father and mother were also present, now both quite gray, but hale and hearty as ever. All were twittering with excitement, and every last one bore a present of some sort for Ben. Prompt on the stroke of midnight, as he nodded over his writing, we swarmed forth, the children's gay voices upraised in the chorus of "Happy Birthday to You." Ben, at first overwhelmed by surprise and pleasure, soon recovered, joining in the spirit of the occasion with the greatest gusto. The gifts were first presented. My mother's was a beautifully knitted earmuff. There had been time to finish only one, she explained, but the mate would soon be completed before cold weather set in. My father's offering was a watch charm, most skillfully gnawed from the shell of a black walnut. Sophia's was an exquisite piece of fancy work, while her husband's was a thimbleful of rare brandy, brought with him in his flight from France. This Ben gaily tossed off with a hearty toast to us all. While the rest made their presentations, I, with 12 or 13 of my strongest brothers, slipped quietly from the room. Just as the last grandchild finished her little speech and curtsy, we staggered in with the hat. Ben's joy knew no bounds. The gifts and honors that had been heaped upon him by the great people of foreign lands seemed nothing in his eyes to the beauties of this hat. He tried it on before the mirror, and it fitted perfectly. It really didn't look bad on him, either. He insisted on wearing it all the rest of the evening, and was much amused when the younger children used its broad brim for a racetrack. Crackers, cheese, and ale appeared for the older folks, and barley sugar for the younger ones. Then there was more singing and dancing. Sophia's eyes sparkled as she went through the graceful figures of the minuet. I even essayed a few steps myself, with fair success. My brother Daniel's oldest girl, who was rather talented that way, recited several poems. The climax of the entertainment came when Sophia and her husband sang, as a duet, one of Ben's poems. She had set it to music, which she had written specially for this occasion. Ben was greatly touched, and made them repeat it several times. I did enjoy the music. After the happy throng had departed, I could see that Ben looked a little worried. "Amos," he said finally, "this hat, this magnificent hat, it seems to contain no place for you. What can I do without you?" "Ben," I said, patting his shoulder, "you can see the responsibilities I have now, all these eager young minds needing my guidance and instruction. You know I'll always be here in the old fur cap, hanging on the bedpost, if you really need me. But you're 81 years old today, Ben. I think you're old enough to get around by yourself." "As usual, Amos," he said, "you're right. Tomorrow I will step out and show this old town what a real hat looks like." "All right," I said, as I curled up in the old fur cap, now all my own. "But do watch out for the mud holes." And here the manuscript ends.